Good evening, Ray.
How are you?
I'm here
Good.
too.
Hi, Penny. I didn't see you on the camera.
Yeah, she's on the camera.
I'm reading over my notes.
Oh, you're so diligent.
Helps me synthesize all the important information flying by.
She's so academic.
Yeah, what can I say?
So how you guys doing? How's Mary? Since
Mary is hobnobbing with the bishop right now.
hobnobbing.
Yes.
Wow.
And with Mark.
Well, of course, they don't,
It's,
they're, they never go away from each other.
It's the annual convocation.
Okay.
Oh,
Is this a
annual.
week-long thing?
No, it's started today. She'll be home on Wednesday.
So,
So-
Pastor we found out she's home with the sick kid.
well,
after she-
Heidi got back from Texas Sunday night. She was supposed to go with us to meet the Afghani family at church, but her oldest is homesick, so she called. Every time I talk to her, she's like, she's all over the place, trying to get. She's got somebody else that's got some clothes. I've got to pick it up at L&M and then go up to the office and get the stuff out of her office, which means I have to get the key. It's like, it just goes on and on and on.
I know. Well, she's doing the convocation actually on Zoom. She's not physically going to it.
Oh,
Yeah.
you can do it on Zoom. That's good.
Well, that's good for her, because otherwise, she just flew in from Texas to do a family wedding that she committed to 6 months ago, so.
Well, she didn't feel she could leave Ben with the kids.
Yeah. So anyway, we're gonna see the Afghani family tomorrow, give them some new clothes since they have one change of clothes,
Where
roughly.
did they find a place for him to live?
Right now, they are staying at an apartment that the dog. The Catholic Church in New London, St. John's, I guess it is, owns a building right next to their church,
St. Joe's.
St. Joseph's. Okay,
Yeah.
sorry.
Whatever.
And they're in the 3rd-story apartment, which Heidi said reminded her of a garret.
What?
A garret.
Okay.
Starving
Actually-
artist.
Yeah. Emily had a dorm room at Con like that.
Oh, what building?
Yeah. Harkness. Yeah, it was one of the
No,
old.
it doesn't,
No.
Hi, Helen.
Hi, you'll all have to excuse me. I'm eating my dinner.
That's
It's
okay.
It's allowed.
We just finished ours, so.
How'd your sermon go yesterday?
I thought it went pretty well. I only had 2 people in church.
Oh.
So I just kind of reminded them that, where 2 or 3 are gathered.
Well, and if they didn't walk out, I guess you're doing okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, on most other Sundays, there's probably 6 or 8 people there, so.
You
It
did
was
really
a
well.
little
She had-
disappointing, but what it is.
Church of 2021.
Yeah, unfortunately, this congregation is contemplating closing, and I think they've had me there since this summer, and it's really not changing. They aren't even able to convince other old-time members to come and join us, even for one Sunday, to just kind of test the waters, but
The denomination?
so we'll see.
What's the denomination, Helen?
Congregational.
So is he part of the UC, United Church of Christ, or?
Yes,
Okay.
they are. Yeah, so they're part of, they are UCC with the United Methodist lay speaker.
Well, they're broad-minded. I grew up
Yeah.
UCC.
Yeah,
Carol,
excuse me a minute.
See if Carol can get the audio going this time.
yeah, I'm dying to hear what her question was.
Hi, Mitch.
Oh,
I'm
good.
on.
You have audio.
Yes, I do have audio.
How's your roommate doing?
To be more specific.
Okay, let me go.
Yes, sir.
Hi.
Is that a bandage on your arm, Carol?
Pardon me?
Is that a bandage?
Oh, what?
A bandage on your arm?
Oh, yes, it is. I had I had carpal tunnel surgery.
When was
I'm
that?
that was last Wednesday, so I'll be getting this off in a couple of days.
Feel better now?
Yeah, pretty much. It's improved. It's still a little swollen.
Our lawyer at work, when I was in Philadelphia, did it, and he was absolutely amazed at how wet, especially the tiny, it was like all microscopic. And
Yeah, I know. I've had it done before. That it's just a couple of little stitches there that'll come out and nothing will show.
Did you have Dr. Sajad?
Yes, I did.
He's cool.
He knows his stuff, that's for sure.
Yeah, he's very youthful and very knowledgeable.
Mhm.
what practice is he part of?
He's
Well,
a-
he's at L&M. He's associated with L&M.
Hello, David.
Is he not able to talk to
Maybe
us?
he's muted.
Yeah, he's muted.
There's a little
But he-
button on the lower left.
We're gonna read lips.
He's not looking at us either. Is it something we said?
No.
Well, he's in Rochester, so he has to look in a different direction than we do.
I see.
Dale's joining. There's Dale.
Hello, good evening.
Hi, Dale.
How's everybody?
How are you?
Wonderful. Thank you for asking.
Oh, great.
Yes. Busy day today, but then my everyday is busy, and that's good.
There we go.
Yes, it is good.
David is with us.
Hello.
Hello.
There he is.
It was unplugged.
Oh.
I had to plug something else into the computer earlier.
So you're so you're the engineer, right?
Yeah. Well, I have a whole bunch of wires here, and I haven't used it all. And I unplugged it for something.
What's the engineers call that? It's like there's a gap between the impedance or something, and then basically
Yeah,
you
it was
plug
really
in.
big, infinite. So I don't know. Well, I have one that's wired. It's not Bluetooth, so it works.
How are you, Anita?
Still,
Hi.
still no snow here. It was like 69 today here or something.
Ah,
I still have roses in the garden.
I have two azalea bushes in bloom,
Wow. Yeah.
and they
Really?
have been in bloom for the past 6 weeks. They're not giving up the ghost yet. I cover them all during night, and then I take the cover off during the daytime, and they're beautiful.
Yeah, we had a hard frost here the other night, Dave.
Did you?
Yeah.
It wasn't a hard frost here. We had some temperatures around 31, but only for a couple of hours. And so it didn't freeze everything. In fact, I had an impatient that was out front that I finally pulled in the garage, I guess, a couple of days ago. And those are really sensitive.
Well, it was 63 degrees today when I was in Waterford. That's rather warm for this time of year.
Indeed.
Yeah.
It was nice.
I'm giving it a few more minutes just to make sure we don't miss anybody.
Sure, we have the time change in here, you know.
Yeah.
I had one of my student workers showed up an hour early on Sunday. He came in and he looked around and he saw that the other student worker wasn't ready to leave. Then he comes over and says, "What time is it?" I said, "It's 11 o'clock." And he starts at noon.
You should have asked me. It's 11 o'clock. Do you know what time it is?
All ahead and spring back.
Hey, Ray, I
I
sent
don't know where is it. He's the conscientious sort.
Oh, okay. I sent you a link, Ray.
Yes, I was going to look at it probably after this.
Yeah, yeah. I like the cartoon about the trash on the moon. It's good.
I thought of you
Yes,
with your celestial interests.
yes.
But you were celestially interested, David.
That?
I didn't know you were celestially interested.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah. I helped build the Frosty Drew Observatory down in Ninigret, Rhode Island, back in '88. And then I helped operate it till about 2002. But
One of my granddaughter's friends from high school got a job at Jet Propulsion Laboratory.
oh, that'd be interesting. They do a lot of interesting stuff.
Yeah, I think she's going to have an experiment going up on one of the space labs or something.
Okay. My sister-in-law up here, their neighbor was doing something with the Hubble a while back. I don't know. So it's kind of, yeah, there's a lot of stuff around.
So let's see. So before we start tonight's topic, I did want to go back, and now that her mic is working, I was hoping Carol could remember what she was trying to ask
Oh,
us last
yeah.
week.
Okay, let me just think a little bit.
I was hoping you wrote it down.
Okay, no, never. Well, it may come to me. It was
Something about the flood. That's what the whole.
And
thing
Gilgamesh
was.
right. Yes,
and Hikidu
I guess,
and all those weird names.
I think it was something about the fact that the people who were writing this down were doing it. They were using materials from different cultures and so forth. But their own thinking evolved over time, and it was, a few hundred years later, so that what we have is really the distilled story from the viewpoint of people who lived a few hundred years after. Whatever. That is not, I had a very, clear and cogent presentation of my thought last week, but you're not getting it tonight.
Well, but I think that's an important point, because I don't think they lifted the story whole and just took the story. I think it's part of when Professor Cohen talks about the themes of the Bible and, the fact that there's a moral order. I think that they took that story and adapted it to how they view their relationship with God.
Yes.
So
yes.
I think that's, what you just said is an important point.
Thank you, Mitch.
Oh, we got somebody else. Janet, that's good. I know if I stalled, I got somebody else. Hi, Janet. So tonight, we're going to go back to Professor Cohen's class. They're going to be discussing the flood story He'll explain the setup. It's some of his graduate students will be discussing it. But I think they're also going to talk about the documentary hypothesis, and this brings up something that I believe Penny asked last time, was do we have the redactor's version of the text? And the answer to that really is no. We do not have the J text, we don't have the P text, we don't have the redactor's notes. You know, they're not hidden away somewhere in the bowels of the Vatican or any place. So so when they call it a documentary hypothesis, it's basically a hypothesis of the text based on the reading of what's in the text as they read it. So it is a hypothesis, and so they haven't seen any evidence to prove it, nor for that matter disprove it. So so I think that that's an important thing to keep in mind. The other thing, actually, and we can talk about some other time, but one of the other things is actually there's actually that in the New Testament as well. There's a thing called the Q text, which we won't get into, but there's the sayings of Jesus, and so, but that's also hypothesized. So, but we won't get into that. So anyways, these are things which.
I'm sorry. We've got a dog here that's playing with her
We'll
ball.
just put us on mute.
We'll just mute.
Okay, well, I'll be meeting you all in a second, but we'll start the video. So are there any other questions?
Yes, Mitch, where are you broadcasting from? It looks like a library.
I'm broadcasting from I moved my office upstairs, so I'm broadcasting from my sort of office, which the background is the Cornell Library.
Oh, all right.
Which is a lot nicer looking than our guest room.
Okay.
Isn't that
You know.
clever?
Clever is right.
Mhm.
If I get our guest rooms whipped into shape, then I'll change it and you can see the real thing. But it's
Okay.
not where I want it to be. So, any other questions? Okay, with that, I'm going to check, make sure I don't have anybody else in the waiting room. I don't. And also, Lee is up to date with posting the videos. So if anybody wants to watch them again, or if I know Helen's daughter,
Daughter-in-law, yep, she watches when she can.
okay, yeah, but they're there and they will stay there. As far as I know, they'll be there indefinitely. So. And also, if anybody is interested in a particular subject as we go on, I mean, these lectures, they're amenable. People can drop in and just watch one if they want. So be sure to invite your friends. So with that, I will share the screen. The sound. Sharing the screen. I'm muting everybody. Again, if there's any problems, please text me. Now, one thing I want to do. I'm closing my email so you don't get those dinging noises. I'm trying to close my email. And with that,
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning. Nice to see you all. I try as a rule not to go back. Always look ahead, don't look back. But I realized afterwards that there was some confusion, perhaps, what I was saying about the Garden of Eden story. So I'm going to spend 3 minutes, not more, just clarifying 2 ambiguities in the Garden of Eden story. The Garden of Eden story, Adam, Eve, the serpent, and the fruit, right? As I said, this story, one can spend a lifetime contemplating the mysteries of this story, trying to understand it. So I simply raised briefly last week two very large, difficult points. One of them was sex, The other one was immortality. So just to explain the ambiguities involved. Is the story of the Garden of Eden, Adam, Eve, the serpent, and the fruit, is that story about sex? Well, going to one reading, of course, the answer is yes. That's the classic Christian reading given to us by Augustine, right? Where the knowledge that is imparted is the knowledge of the sexual knowledge, right? And human reproduction is the result of that primal sin in the garden. Is that reading right or wrong? I can't tell you. I can simply tell you this is how it's read. And there are signals in the text that the discovery of sex or sexual knowledge, this thing about being embarrassed to be naked, right, is there in the text. My point, however, in response to that was, it's not necessarily there. It's not obviously explicitly there. And there are other ways to read that story in which it is not there. Right? That's when I quoted the medieval rabbinic commentator Rashi, whom we'll hear about later also today, right? Who argued that Adam and Eve had engaged in human sexual reproduction while they still were in the garden. It has nothing to do with rebellion against God or with the fall. So that point is open, right? You, the interpreter, have to decide what you see in the story, what you get out of the story. Similarly, the issue of immortality. Was Adam created immortal? For many readers, the answer is yes. Surely Adam was created immortal, and death is the function of sin. The reason that humans are mortal is because of sin. Once again, you can read the story that way, and many people have read the story that way. However, as usual, the problem is the story doesn't go smoothly, right? There are problems with this story, or with this version. Notably, when God says at the end of the story, after the expulsion, you better make sure he doesn't get to eat of the fruit of the tree of life. Then he'll be like us. He'll be like one of the gods. Or perhaps he'll be like us, the God. Right, which strongly suggests that Adam was not immortal. Now you could say in reply, well, he's immortal because he's become mortal because he was expelled from the garden. Had he still been in the garden, he would have been immortal. To which I say, maybe. Depends on how you interpret the passage. So my point simply here was that so much depends on the interpreter, because the story is so wonderfully rich and wonderfully ambiguous. So today we're going to discuss the flood story, using the flood story as the paradigmatic example of the documentary hypothesis. So we have already alluded to this several times over, and already Kugel has already discussed this several times over. But today is the session we're going to spend the bulk of our time asking ourselves, what's this documentary hypothesis? What does it mean? And is it plausible? Am I convinced? So, just to make sure we begin with the big question, the big point. Has anybody out there ever seen a scroll, which is the scroll of J?
No.
Thank you. No. How about in the Dead Sea Scrolls? No. How about in the secret archives of the Vatican? No. How about in any library, the Jewish Theological Seminary of America Library, which has the largest collection of Hebrew manuscripts in the Western Hemisphere? No. Has anybody ever seen a scroll of P?
No.
No. You're catching on. Has anybody seen a scroll of E?
No.
No. Do we have the workroom, the workshop notes of R? No. All of this is, go back to your high school geometry, all of this is a hypothesis. That's why we call it a documentary hypothesis. You ask somebody, show me this J and P of which you are talking, I have to say in reply, I don't have J and P. I can only show it to you in the form in which we have it now, which, according to the hypothesis, it is buried. It has been sewn into the fabric of our Torah, and one thing we do as interpreters is to extract it and reconstruct it, reimagine it. So, Professor, does this mean the whole thing is fake? The whole thing is just a game? Just an agreed upon fable, as Voltaire would have said? Maybe. Definitely. And whenever you see claims about J and P, you should always ask yourself, where is the evidence? How do I know the guy the gal, the professor, the writer, the scholar, is not just making it up. That's what we're doing today. Are we making this stuff up, or is it convincing? Is it real? That's our task for today. And at the end of today, so I'm going to give a few introductory remarks based upon this little table that I constructed. Then we're going to have a special treat, have our 3 TFs slug it out. Going to have tag team wrestling, right? With the 3 of them trying to convince each other of the truth of their position. I'll introduce the protagonists in a few moments, right? And then at the end, we'll have a discussion from the floor, I hope. And then we're going to have a vote. True, false. Who thinks that it's true and who thinks it's just a bunch of malarkey? Okay, that's coming attraction. Sorry, that's today. And then at the end, we'll squeeze in some other stuff. So let's go start with this little chart. These things should be reviewed, because this stuff was already discussed by Kugel explicitly in earlier readings in our course, and implicitly it's come up already. But now's the time to put it all together, to ask whether it makes sense. So, when we read the Torah, 5 books of Moses, that's the battleground about the documentary hypothesis. When we read the Torah, what is our working assumption? So if you're a modern Bible scholar, your working assumption is, or at least you claim, wink, wink, you claim, I don't have any assumption. I am completely objective. I am completely neutral. I don't have any assumptions. Okay, I don't have any assumptions. I read the Bible the way I read any other text. I read the text and I try to make sense out of it as best I can. That's the stated credo of modern Bible scholars. Okay, every reader has a bias of some sort. Thank you. That was my wink, wink, and ha-ha. I was referring to that. Okay. Traditionalists, however, be they Jews or be they Christians, they do begin with assumption, and they're not afraid to state it out loud. Right? My assumption is, I, a traditionalist Jew, a traditionalist Christian, whoever as I might be, right? I believe that the Torah is a unitary composition written by one person at one moment in time. That person is Moses, and that moment in time is, well, sometime a long time ago after the Exodus from Egypt, before the Israelites made their way into Canaan. The key point here is that the traditionalist believes the Torah is a single organic unitary composition. The modern Bible scholar says, I don't assume that, because I don't know that that's true. And in fact, the modern Bible scholar continues, when I start reading the Bible, I discover contradictions and inconsistencies. One passage here is not entirely consistent with the passage there, or they're flat out contradiction. 2, 7. Or the names are different, or whatever. So for the modern Bible scholar, the contradictions and inconsistencies are evidence that there's something going on. It's evidence that the text is not a unitary composition. It's evidence that the text is assembled from pre-existing pieces. What we call sources. Now, what does a traditionalist do? Does the traditionalist read the Bible and not see contradictions and inconsistencies? Oh no, of course not. Traditionalists read the Bible very carefully, sometimes far more carefully than modern Bible scholars. They see contradictions, they see inconsistencies. They're not stupid. On the contrary. But the point is, because they're beginning from a different point, when they see contradictions and inconsistencies, they say, that's not evidence of sources. That simply means these are passages that require interpretation. And for all we know, perhaps that's why they're there, is because the author wants us to interpret them. It's meant to be food for the mill, grain for the mill. Well, we don't have to go quite that far, but we can simply say consistencies, contradictions are only apparent, they're not real, because once we interpret Scripture properly, these all melt away. How about the different names of God? For the modern Bible scholar, these again are prime evidence for, again, different sources, which use different names for God. And ultimately, they all get blended together. However, we can distinguish between them and separate them. The traditionalist reader says, no, of course that's not true. They're all the same God, and different names simply reflect different aspects of the divine. Different aspects of the divine. So we're emphasizing this aspect, we have this name, emphasize that aspect, we have that name, and fine. Doesn't always work so smoothly, I have to admit, so it needs a little interpretation also. So modern Bible scholars say not only are there sources in the text, in the Torah, not only that, but we can reconstruct those sources. We can identify them. We can give them names. We can then try to locate them in time, place, and society. We can say, this source is the J source, which refers not just to the name of God that it uses, YHWH or JHWH, not the name of God it uses, but also the whole constellation of literary characteristics, ideas, religious themes. And that source we can call the P source, not only because it's priestly in orientation, but we think it comes from priestly schools and reflects priestly values and priestly conception of the world. So not only, so again, I'm saying the logic. Logic is we have evidence that there are sources, we posit that we can reconstruct those sources, and then we posit that we can locate those sources in time and place. Now, admittedly, we modern Bible scholars are not of unanimity about these questions. Right? Every PhD student has a different take on these questions. True, we argue about these things, but the fact that we argue incessantly about how to reconstruct these things is not evidence against the fundamental working assumption, which is born out of reading the text. To which the traditionalist says, I'll speak politely here in mixed company, baloney. This J, this P, it's all nonsense. It never is, it never was, you'll never find it, because it never existed. You're making it up. This priestly school, this J school, I don't know what you're talking about. Show it to me. It's not anywhere, it's nothing. That's what the traditionalists will say. So how did the Torah come to be as we have it? Torah as we have it, according to modern Bible scholars, is put together from these mysterious sources, sometimes called documents, and put together by an even more mysterious person whom we call R. Mr. R, right? Mr. Redactor, who took these sources, or perhaps in some versions of the story, there already were pre-existing redactions of the material. He may not have been the first one to try to put it together, but he's the last one to put them together. These various bits and pieces get stitched together brilliantly by a redactor. Why do I say brilliantly? So brilliantly that he allows the traditionalists to think that there was no redactor. That's how brilliant he is. That his own presence is concealed. It is so thoroughly concealed that perhaps it wasn't there. Or if you are a traditionalist, that's what you'll say. However, we modern Bible scholars are clever. We can see through the work of the redactor, and in spite of all of his clever tricks that he has brought to bear so as to produce a unitary narrative, we can still see it's not. We still see seams, inconsistency, bumps in the road. We have our ways of detecting the work of the redactor. To which the traditionalist will say, redactor, schredactor, I just don't see it. It's an author. The classic battlefield between the modern Bible scholars and the traditionalists is the book of Genesis. The story is the book of Genesis. That is the classic battlefield between these two approaches to how to read the Torah. And I think out of all the examples that are adduced, Genesis 1 versus Genesis 2, about which we've already spoken, is one classic illustration of the documentary hypothesis at work. And the other one will be the flood story. If either of these convinces you, then you're on your way on the documentary hypothesis. And if these don't convince you, then I don't think anything will convince you. And I say again, the issue is now not right or wrong, smart or stupid. The issue here is how to read. Right? Which mode of reading seems to make sense? Which mode of reading works for you? And some people here will be convinced, and others may well not be convinced. This hypothesis is very hard to prove. It's also very hard to disprove. So we're talking here about modes of reading. That's fundamentally what's at stake here. How do we make sense out of the scriptural narratives in Genesis? So today we're going to talk about the flood narrative. All right, I've summoned 3 experts to come help me with this, who are going to slug it out to see whether we are convinced by the documentary hypothesis, or, and I would say the burden of proof, I think, is upon the person who supports the documentary hypothesis. The burden of proof is not on the traditionalist, I think. The burden of proof would be on the documentary hypothesis guy, person, proponent, that's the word, proponent, right, to prove his case. And if you simply say in reply, I don't think it's been proven, then things return to where they were, which is to say, there is no documentary hypothesis. Okay, so I summoned our PhD students. Richard Elliott Friedman, in the homework on your website, is a strong proponent of the documentary hypothesis. So Eric is going to take that position, presenting Richard Elliott Friedman and defending him. And attempting to attack and bring him down is our very own Matt Brasseur, and with some help from Yoni Miller. So we're going to listen to them hack it out, and then have your questions at the ready.
So in the flood story, we can find 2 distinct sources. Despite the original appearance that there's just one author, we know, and I'll show you how we know in short order, that there were 2 distinct scrolls originally. And a third person took those 2 scrolls and wove them together into one story. And we can untangle all this. Now, specifically in the flood story, the 2 scrolls are the scroll written by J and a scroll written by P. The third person is R, to which you heard about, or about which you heard a little bit earlier, who wove them together. Now, this is quite a remarkable situation. It's not something we see in a lot of literature, so how could we claim this? How could we really know that this is the case? This is what I intend to show you now. Now, there are several factors that go into our reconstruction of this scenario. So I'm going to go through each factor and give a few examples. Now, one thing I want to highlight here is that this is only part of the evidence. There's a mountain of evidence for this theory, and I'm only focusing on a few points here. So first, there are repetitions in the story that are awkward when you read them as it is given to you in your Bible as you have it today. But when we separate the text into 2 sources, these repetitions disappear. This is a major reason to think that we had 2 documents that were woven into 2. So I'll give 3 examples. First, God commands Noah to get into the ark twice when you read the text as it is. So you can see in the chart above, if you were just reading through, you would read downward, and you would have, you shall enter the ark, and then shortly thereafterward, go into the ark. God didn't need to tell Noah this twice, I don't think. It makes much better sense to think that these were 2 stories originally. 2, God commands Noah to gather the animals twice. Again, perhaps Noah was rather blockheaded and stubborn, but I think that these were 2 original stories. And finally, if that were not enough for you, not only does he command Noah to get into the ark twice, tell him to gather the animals twice, but Noah actually gets into the ark and gathers the animals twice. So after saying, you shall enter the ark and you shall gather all the animals, it says Noah did so. Then again it says, get into the ark, take all the animals, and Noah did just as Yahweh commanded. Surely it is easier to think that we have 2 sources here, not 1. And so just to mention a few of the other examples, there are many here, but God sees human wickedness twice.
Eric, should I move the page?
No, this is fine right there, yeah. So I'm just going to list the other examples and not give you time to look at them.
They're more convincing that way.
But there are a number of other ones. God sees human wickedness twice. He states his intention to destroy mankind twice. The reason Noah is spared is stated twice. God twice announces that the flood is coming, and twice rain is described as falling down. So these are just a few examples. Now I'll leave it to my opponents to take time to give their positions on this.
My distinguished colleague has opened his comments by saying that this is a rare way for a document to be, for a piece of literature to be composed. Indeed, it's incredibly rare. I don't know of another document other than Tatian's Diatessaron that has actually been composed in quite this way. So it's not just rare, it's unique. And I gladly admit that these repetitions are problematic. But I wonder about how it's possible to evaluate these repetitions. By modern standards, we wouldn't expect a modern author to make these kinds of repetitions. It sounds foolish, but I wonder if we're judging by an inaccurate aesthetic, whether we are looking at these repetitions as being unintentional or as a consequence of putting multiple things together, or if in a different aesthetic, this kind of repetition was considered a mark of good style. In fact, you would consider all of Genesis 1:1 to 2:4 to be a single document, correct?
Agreed.
Yeah. That's one of the most obnoxiously repetitious passages in the Bible. God did this on this day. God said it, then it happened. God said it, and this happened. God said it's good. God said it's good. God said it's good. It happens again and again and again. This kind of repetition is just piled up all over itself. And surely these aren't all taken from different kinds of sources. Similarly, this kind of repetition that you're talking about is considered to be a mark not of different sources, but of the very same sources. If you look at Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27, in those verses, God creates humankind. But if you look then at, you would attribute that to the P source. If you look at Genesis 5, verses 1 and 2, again, God creates, this theme of God creating humankind is recapitulated. You would identify that as part of the P source again. So if this is supposed to be a continuous P document, not only do we have in this putative single document the story being told twice, the fact that it's being told twice is offered as evidence that the document is continuous.
My task is to season Matt's disagreements with Eric with the viewpoint of Rashi, R-A-S-H-I, Rabbi Solomon, the son of Isaac, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, who was a Jewish traditionalist exegete, a biblical interpreter, who lived in northern France, born in the year 1040, died in the year 1105. Very easy to remember because he lived for only 25 minutes, 1040 to 1105. You'll remember that forever. Before I get to Rashi's comments on this episode, and he has many, I just would like to address a number of Eric's points. With regard to his specific examples, let's take the first example. So unfortunately, Eric has given you a somewhat decontextualized quote. However, even from the fragments of evidence that he has presented us, you can still tell that there's a difference between these two texts. The first text, "You shall enter the ark," which Eric says is repeated later in 7:1, is actually part of God's plan that he reveals to Noah before the flood, much like a pilot reveals his flight plan to the passengers before he takes off. So when the pilot says, "Oh, I'm going to taxi the airplane down the runway, we're going to take it up to a cruising altitude of 30,000 feet," that doesn't mean that he's actually doing those things as he says them. He's revealing his plan beforehand. So when God says, "You shall enter the ark," Essentially, he's telling Noah, well, I'm just letting you know that when I'm going to destroy the earth, this is what you're going to do. And then in verse 7:1, God commands Noah, okay, it's showtime, go into the ark. That's not a repetition. In fact, if we look closely at the verbs themselves, from a grammatical standpoint, they're two totally different kinds of verbs. You shall go into the ark is an indicative verb, whereas go into the ark is an imperative verb. So that example is not a repetition, is evident from a close reading of the text itself. And by the same token, with regard to Eric's third example, Noah did so. Here I'll draw on Rashi's comment. So Eric points out that the fact that Noah seems to have done the same thing twice is a repetition. However, perhaps Noah did so means that Noah built the ark. What he did is not specified. And in verse 7:5, and Noah did just as the Lord commanded him, perhaps that's Noah entering the ark. So before we take these decontextualized fragments and we proceed to construct this massive argument that essentially undermines the authority of the Bible, I think it warrants taking a closer look at the texts themselves, and so doing, we find, in fact, that the Bible is a unified document with authorial integrity.
A couple things that you might have been confused by, or that I think they pulled the wool over your eyes on a couple of those things there. First of all, the claim was made that you shall enter the ark is a different verb than go into the ark. It is indeed a different verb, but it would be a mistake to think that the verb in the first case couldn't be a command. That verb could be a command. It's not clear just from the language that it has to be, that it can't be a repetition. Further, on a normal reading of the text, when it says Noah did this, and you had a list of things, if we're not trying to bring this together as a unified document, we would normally read that as referring to everything that came before. So it's an ad hoc hypothesis to say that it only refers to part of what was referred to before and part of what came the second time. So I think that still stands as clear evidence. Now, Matt raises very good points that repetition sometimes does serve stylistic purposes, even within the sources. P himself does like to repeat himself, and so I certainly agree with you that repetition is not always an example of several sources, but here we have something very different. We're not merely repeating a refrain, God saw that it was good, over and over again. We're actually repeating events in a narrative, and that's not normal. You don't go through and say X, Y, and Z happened, and then again say X, Y, and Z happened. It still stands, I think, as strong evidence, but we are convinced by. But it's the way they all come together so precisely. They all work together and enable us to reconstruct separate documents. So second, in addition to repetitions, we have what I would call contradictions. We have contradictions in the text that simply don't make sense if one person sat down and wrote out the story. When you write a story, you're generally aware of what you wrote in the first paragraph when you come to the second, and you don't directly contradict it. So what we have here is a very unique situation in which two stories were brought together by a third person. So take a look at the dates that you have in the chart here. Now, what I'd like to show you is that these dates, as written, if you follow them closely, simply do not work. And instead, we can make them work by putting them together into two separate sources. So first, in 7:11, you come across a dating, 2nd month, 17th day. Continue along a bit, and you're told that rain falls for 40 days. So, 40 days. Next, we have the flood increases for 150 days. Now, this is a little odd to begin with in a lot of ways, but one way you might try to put it together is you'd say there was rain, and then the flood increased an additional 150 days. So that's 190 days, but then we get another dating. 7th month, 17th day. Okay, so do the math on this. This is 5 months, and without going into all the details, these are 30-day months. So 30-day months, 5 months, 30-day months, that's 150 days, but if you add it up, that's 190 days. But notice, if we simply separate the sources into two, everything works beautifully. 2nd month, 17th day, 150 days, 7th month, 17th day. Then we have a few more dates. Now we move up to the 10th month, first day, and then all of a sudden it says at the end of 40 days. Where did this 40 days come from? If we separate into two sources, it makes perfect sense. We have one with these datings, 150 days, etc., and another in which rain falls for 40 days. Then at the end of the 40 days, Noah opens the window of the ark. One more contradiction. How many animals went into the ark? If you're reading along and you're not aware of the two sources, you first will read that there are two of every type of animal. Then as you continue to read, you get something different. You get two of some animals, but the clean animals. Now this means a ritually pure animal. The clean animals, you get 7 pairs. Not 1 pair, but 7 pairs. But then it switches back once again, and we get, of all the animals, clean and unclean, 2. So we have one claim, and then the opposite claim, and then back to the first claim again. So if we separate into two sources, this all works beautifully. If it's one document, it simply doesn't make sense.
A contradiction is two statements that attempt to say opposite things. The car is blue, the car is red. These aren't the same car. But if you look at how he has divided these putative sources, on one side there's reference to a flood, and on the other side there's reference to rain. Flood and rain are not the same thing. They can be related to one another, but these contradictions in numbers, one is describing the length, duration of the flood, and the other is describing the length and duration of the rain, which can coincide but need not. Anybody who has looked at the flooding that's going on right now in Colorado, the rain has long subsided, but the flooding still continues. Again, in this, we have rain continuing for a period of 40 days, and then the floods going on for a considerably longer period. I'll admit the numbers here are confusing. I'm not sure how the 40 and 150 are related to one another.
But Rashi's strategy is to, again, maintain the integrity of the story, to maintain a unified timeline. So yes, it might look like it's a 40-day flood in one source and an 150-day 40-day rain, in one source and 150-day flood in the other source. What Rashi does is to look at the entire narrative from beginning to end. And we're told that the flood began in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day. That's chapter 7, verse 11. And we're told that the flood ended 1 year and 10 days later, in the 601st year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 27th day. That's verse 8:14, which incidentally is not mentioned in my esteemed colleague's table. So what Rashi does is he takes this datum, that the flood was 365 days long, and he works backwards quite elegantly, essentially coordinating all of the dates and all of the numbers in the narrative and coming up with a 365-day long flood. So that includes 40 days of rain. It includes 150 days of flooding. It includes a 40-day period after which Noah opens the window of the ark. It includes the 3 dispatches of the dove. There were 7 days between each of them, and when you arrive at the final tally, and this is something that we'll post on the website, in fact, Rashi very elegantly is able to coordinate the dates of the flood with a 365-day calendar. So while it may appear on the basis of this evidence that there are contradictions, I'll defer to what Matt said before, which is that a contradiction is one source saying up and the other source saying down. The fact that one source has the number 40 and one source has the number 150 does not mean that they can't be harmonized together.
The claim was made that rain and flood are different things, but look closely again, 7:11, the rain fell 40 days and 40 nights. Then look at 7:24 and 8:2. After 150 days, the rain from the sky was held back. So that harmonization, in my view, doesn't quite work.
You also listed this supposed contradiction between the pure and impure animals. So this identification or designation of as pure and impure deals with cultic and its fitness to eat and its fitness for sacrifice. But this category of impure is a far larger category than the category of pure or clean. And so would it not make sense to paraphrase the instruction as generalized for the impure animals, and then in the specific case, which is for this small minority, to give a special instruction for those animals that you might have to sacrifice out of thanksgiving to God when you get out of this ordeal? Because if you had sacrificed the clean animals, the only clean animals, as soon as you got out of the ark, you wouldn't have any more to sacrifice.
So what Matt is saying is that when God instructs Noah to take 2 pairs of every animal, it's in fact a legal minimum. You should take a minimum of 2 pairs of each animal.
One pair.
I'm sorry, you should take a minimum of 1 pair of each animal. And with regard to pure animals, however, you should take 7 pairs. There's no contradiction there. Those are supplementary and complementary to each other.
Well, thank you both. I certainly respect, your willingness to look closely at the text and the details, and really these are very beautiful readings. I respect what you're doing here. At the same time, if we just look at the details as they go through, let's suppose what you're saying is correct. Let's suppose that we have a statement of a minimum of 2 of each. And then it clarifies, now 7 pairs of each and 2 of the other. But then why go back in the following statement and very explicitly and deliberately say that of the clean and the unclean there will be 2?
A minimum of 2.
Fair enough, thank you. Okay, if time permitted me, I would go on, as I'm sure that doesn't surprise you. And there's even more evidence for what we're saying here. And what I would suggest is that, again, any one of these pieces of evidence might not be so convincing, but when we add them all up, when we put them all together and see the way that they all fit with each other, none of these pieces of evidence points in different directions, all in the same direction, we have a very convincing case that, as I suggested, there were 2 stories, a third person put them together and wove them into the text that we have today.
I would say that the evidence shows tensions, shows certain contradictions, but the way that the most effective way of dealing with these is not to assume a unique kind of composition that's never been attested anywhere else in the entire world, but rather to yield to the authority of this author and the authority of the way this text has been transmitted to us.
Where do dinosaurs fit into this?
I think they're in the J source.
Yes. So why is R allowed the contradictions to endure, giving now fodder for modern Bible scholars centuries later?
So that is an interesting question. You would think that R would smooth out the contradictions, but I think that he left them there because the 2 texts that he had were already sacred. So he didn't want to change them because he viewed them as holy scripture, and so he wanted to keep them exactly intact as they were, but weave them together.
Or to put it in other words, if you asked R, don't you realize the text that you have produced is uneven, full of contradictions and inconsistencies? Look at this chart. R, don't you think you did a lousy job? R would say in reply, presumably, I did the best I could. I can't just go around riding roughshod over these sacred texts. These are sacred traditions. I can't do that. I have to live with them as they are. I did the best I could. We would love to get our hands on R, but it's hard for me to say that any part of Scripture is not important for its audience, for its community, for the textual community. Right? I assume that for them, everything is important. Nothing is not important. Having said that, I asked you on the syllabus, do you think it's a good idea for Christian fundamentalists to go off to Mount Ararat every year and look for the remains of Noah's Ark? Right, my suggestion there was, at least for us moderns, we sense that this is not a historical narrative, this is a narrative of a different kind. It's not a history, it's a story, right? So for us moderns, we sense that there's a difference. I don't know whether the ancients did that. Just as for some modern readers still don't do that. That's an excellent suggestion, right? Maybe these details, which we're making much, maybe we're making too much of these little details. Okay, so why did I say the burden of proof is with the modern Bible scholars who demonstrate it's documentary as opposed to a unitary composition? I would argue the burden of proof is upon them precisely because there is no clear explicit statement that that these books are multi-sourced. The simple natural reading of this book, as of most books, is that you assume it's written by one person, one author. Now, it's true, the Torah nowhere says, repeat, the Torah nowhere says, this book was written by Moses, servant of God. At most, what you get is large chunks of the book of Deuteronomy claimed to be written by Moses, servant of God, and various paragraphs scattered throughout Exodus through Numbers are attributed to God speaking to Moses. But nowhere is there a grand master statement which says this book was written by Moses, servant of God. That's a later belief. You can already see that growing in the prophetic books, referring back to this book. Nonetheless, I would suggest the simple natural reading is that the book is a book. It has an author. And the burden of proof would be upon someone who says that no, this is not a single unitary composition. It in fact is drawn from all kinds of different sources.
It might be really helpful to draw a parallel, and not to get too far afield, but in our debate, Matt referenced Tatian's Diatessaron. So we do have one other example in history where this exact thing happened, and we do have documentary evidence that it happened. And it was done with the 4 Gospels of the New Testament. Someone took the 4 Gospels and they had parallel accounts, and he wove them together because in his view, they were all true and they did all work out together, and he simply wanted to show how, by weaving them together. So R had a similar situation. He had 2 different accounts, he thought they were both true, and he just wove them together, even though it left these difficulties.
And who is convinced that a documentary hypothesis reading is a more natural reading and explains Scripture better than the reading which assumes a unitary composition? Thank you very much, everyone. See you Wednesday.
Okay. So I'm unmuting people.
I apologize for my dog. You'll hear.
What?
You're gonna hear the dog. If
That's
I'm
okay.
unmuted. She's playing with her ball.
I'm going to contemplate on that which was said tonight. So good night, everyone.
Oh, good idea.
Very interesting, man. Oh, good night.
I remember,
Go ahead, Carol.
I remember what I was going to say last time, but what was taught tonight, made it much more concrete. But I don't think people back then, the readers of Scripture, were so hung up on actual fact and avoiding repetition and all of that. They just had a different approach. It wouldn't have bothered them too much to see two different accounts woven together with some kind of apparent contradictions.
Yeah, actually, and in one of your essays in the Jewish Study Bible, the author makes exactly that same point, that in the Near Eastern culture, they were comfortable with the expression they use with multiple explanations for causality was the expression they used. But the point was is that is just exactly what you said. There was a different approach to whether or not they thought these things were true. But one of the curious statements that was made that I wanted to follow up on was one of the things that one of the students said, which is that if we were to accept the documentary hypothesis and question the unitary composition of the Bible, that would challenge the authority of the Bible. And I just wanted to find out if anybody does the documentary hypothesis in your mind, would that challenge the authority of the Bible?
No.
No. No, in fact, actually, I would be absolutely aghast if there was one source of something as important as what is being said. You're going to
Yeah.
get multiple things. And the thing that I was surprised that the student who was trying to make the case is the fact that when you do separate it into two pieces in this one example, it flows, it matches, it makes, at least for us modern Bible scholars, it makes the story clearer. So even if the original audience didn't mind having repetitions and things that don't match, us modern folks, I'd rather see it separated, like Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. I would hate to see them put together, because then it's like, whoa, this is just a mess. Whereas you read it separately and okay, you get one version and then you get another version. And I kind of like the first version because it's short and sweet and gets to the point. The other one is more involved and more mythological. Okay. And putting them together just makes a mess. I don't like messes.
I think when you read it, I think if you read it and take it apart and slowly read it, I see something totally different. I see it saying that it rained for 40 days, but the flood was there for 150. We've seen that happen here, that it would rain for 2 days, but you don't see the flood until a couple of days later. I mean, it says that the seams of the earth, I'm looking in the Jewish study Bible, where it says all the fountains of the great deep burst open. So at the time, there was water on the earth before the rains.
Oh, yeah.
So if you combine the rains and the waters of the earth, the water's going to last 150 days. It doesn't say anything from what I read a couple of different times, it doesn't say that it rained 150 days. That's just my interpretation.
I like what Carol said too about the fact that, when they wrote things at those times, they didn't worry about a lot of details like we do today.
Right.
And one of the things that back then too, we don't think about is parchments and papyrus and stuff was just not readily available down at the local store. It was valuable, it was expensive, and you didn't waste anything. So if one story was written and the other came along a little later, they said, well, we got to add this in. We might have just said, well, we're not going to write the whole thing over. We don't have the scrolls to do that. We don't really know what the thinking was at the time.
I had a question on sorry, you can finish.
Well, that's okay.
But speaking of the scrolls, did he mention the P's, a P and J, but they don't know where they are and they haven't been found. No one has seen them. Is that correct? I wanted to get clarity on that.
That is correct.
So do they exist?
What?
Do they exist?
They are hypothesized to exist. They actually, nobody's ever seen them. The reason that and where they come from is one of the J scroll or the J text is based on the name that they use for God, which is YHWH, and the Germans started this, so they called him Jehovah, which isn't really right. But so that's the J text. The P text is theorized to come from a priestly group. And so, so these are all in theory, and then the R one is also in theory. Nobody's seen the redactor either. So, so these are all just really hypotheses based on what we just talked about as far as the different versions that people see. You know, different versions some people see in the story and other people's don't. Let's put it that way. Because
Interesting.
They also mentioned, Mitchell, you know, this thing about him having a redactor, a third person. It's just any thought, why did they bring the redactor in? Why maybe not the second author just said, I'm going to put these together and wrote them out. I don't know whether there's what their evidence is to think there was a third person, other than maybe one or two.
And why does the redactor have to be one person? Could it be a group of people that worked on this?
Oh, yeah, actually, well, you're correct. It could well have been a group. The theory again is the redactor did the redactor's work sometime in just immediately after the exile ended. So it was a reasonably late production compared to some of the other parts.
What year would that be?
Let's see,
Or estimate?
560. The exile started in 587, 586, and then they came back 40 years later. So it's about 540-ish.
Okay.
BCE.
BC, right, okay.
Yeah.
Mm.
The assumption too, and again, it's an hypothesis or assumption that if you want to talk about different sources, that they were existing sources. So they were full, well, the thought is they were full stories that had a cultural history to them. And so they didn't have, it's not one, as Dave said, the second person. It's a cultural history, oral story, and some other person or group of people, as Carol might mention, decided that both of them had validity and value and wanted to put them together. I still don't understand why they didn't do what they did with Genesis and say, here's one version, here's another version, read both of them, you'll get the gist.
That's one of many questions for the
Figure it
redactor.
Instead of putting them together, it just screws everything up.
Although sometimes I've wondered is the purpose of the stories, because if you look at, say, the first Genesis story, it really does lend itself. He was talking about the repetitiveness of the story, but it lends itself. I think it lends itself to say if you're going to use it liturgically.
Yeah.
If you were,
Right.
so the story is that's something we don't have. Was there some liturgical or some ceremonial use that the stories had, where they were maybe recited in during prayers in a certain way, because that's the way we do ours as far as like there's a call and response or responsive reading, if you will. So that's one of the things we don't know about the context of how the stories were used.
Yeah, some of them were actually almost sung. I mean, if they're an oral history, in order for people to remember it.
Yeah. So, because I was thinking about that with Noah when he talks about the repetition. Maybe there was something in that, the way they used the story.
Well, sometimes we repeat things to make it sink in. I don't know.
Over here.
Well, we do that in our worship. Well, not so much to sink in, but we do that as part of our worship liturgies.
Yeah, repetition.
So. I probably should have sent it to her, but they did give you a link in your notes to the Richard Freeman article from a Nova special that was done on the flood. And so I sent you the link so you can look at that. That's kind of a short version of Richard Freeman's. He's got a lot of books. You can look at those if you want. But that's sort of a short summary of the thing. And if you refer back to your notes, you'll see the charts that they talk about during the lectures.
Okay.
So. Anything else?
It just looks like that class was a lot of fun. The professor was a hoot.
Well, he's retired, but he was very popular.
Yeah, I bet.
So we will adjourn for tonight, and I'll see you all next week. I wanted to ask you to give some thought. I don't have any plans that would prevent me from just keeping going through the holidays and, in the week between Christmas and Easter and Christmas and New Year's and everything. But if there's some consensus you'd rather stop, that's, I can go either way. So, but you don't need to decide tonight. But if, as I said, I can do the class, do the recording, and it'll be up there if people aren't available during that time.
Yeah, Ray and I won't be here for the week of Thanksgiving.
Oh, okay. All right. I will probably do the class on Thanksgiving week. But as I said, Lee's been pretty good about getting the recording stuff on the website, so they'll be there. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank
Well,
you.
Thank you.
Good night,
you.
everyone.
Good night.
Hi to Suzanne. for me.
Okay.
Yes, please.